Okay, so today is October
16.
16th,
I think so.
2018, and it's an interview with James Plunky Branch. And you've had a really amazing story. You're born into a working class family on the south side of Richmond, 1947. Your high school music teacher, Joseph Kennedy, integrates the Richmond Symphony Orchestra. And many of your music teachers in high school were touring with these world-class jazz artists. Then you go to Columbia, New York to study chemistry, where you start a soul band, and then take part in the student occupation in 1968. And then you move to the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in San Francisco and are active in Africanist musical experiments and black nationalist political movements, and you start the band Juju. I think all of this deserves a full-length documentary, but today I want to ask you specifically about the Richmond music scene and how you think it's changed over time. So you moved back here in 1974, and in your memoir you talk about how you had to shift your aesthetic focus back towards soul and R&B that you came up in, because, as you described, the white and the black population in Richmond weren't exactly receptive to Africanist musics and those radical politics at the time. And you become a key figure in changing the scene during the kind of tail end of the civil rights era, which in Richmond had a longer tail than in other parts of the country. And you started a lot of nonprofit arts initiatives, and you got existing nonprofits to begin giving to the black population in Richmond. So I'd like to hear your perspective on how the Richmond scene has changed, maybe how it's remained the same since that time. And I'd be really interested in hearing about particular venues where you've played and their connection to the community in town.
Well, you've summarized my career quite adequately. Thanks for reading my book. All that you say is true. I almost have to start with my start, and you pegged it correctly. I had the fortune to work with a number of my band instructors early on who were moonlighting as jazz musicians. There were people like Johnny Payton, who eventually started a big band here. He was my first band instructor in the 5th grade in the 50s. If we fast forward to the 2000s or the 90s, I had a chance to play with him in a big band. So his legacy spanned pre-civil rights all the way to post-civil rights. He was a great saxophonist. A friend of his, Tuscan Jasper, was a music teacher here in Richmond, played trumpet. Royal Singleton was one of my instructors who played oboe. And then, of course, the great Joseph Kennedy, who did help integrate the Richmond Symphony, but was a jazz musician of some renown, recorded some. He was a violinist, a jazz violinist, played with Ahmad Jamal, and went to Japan and all over the world playing jazz violin. Those musicians gave me my starting point. I started playing music in the Richmond Public Schools in the 50s, and by the time I was in high school, the civil rights movement was in full vogue, particularly in the South. The music that I grew up with was kind of an amalgamation of gospel and R&B. Radio in the 50s and early 60s was as segregated as other parts of our society, and black radio, of which there were at first initially only one black radio station, then WANT. Later we had WENZ and WKIE, but all of them had a similar format, and that was they played all styles of black music, which was mostly R&B and later Motown, but a smattering of jazz and certainly gospel on Sundays. And that's the music that I grew up with, and that's the music of Richmond as I know it. Now, let me say this about Richmond. Richmond is has been a peculiar marketplace for music. It was once thought that Richmond was such a tough market to convince about music that it became a test market for black music, black record companies. Legend has it that in the 50s and 60s, record companies would use Richmond as a test market. If a record did well in Richmond, it could do well anywhere. Even acts like Average White Band, which is a group from the UK. Their record was first released here in Virginia under that theory that we will test it here. Richmond is sort of mid-Atlantic but south, and so the taste runs from the same taste as Philadelphia down through the Carolinas and into Georgia. So actually it wasn't just quirky that they would use Richmond as a test market. Geographically, we sat in sort of a mid-zone between the mid-Atlantic states and the South. So that's what music was like pre-Civil Rights era. And I'd have to say it didn't change much in the late 60s and early 70s while I was away. I went to college in 1965. I didn't return to Richmond as a full-time resident until 74. So that was a 9 or 10 year span where the civil rights movement peaked and then tailed off. And when I got back to Richmond after my 10 years away, the music scene had not changed substantially. The city was still segregated. Music was pretty much segregated. Though I have to say, there was some crossover to the music. Motown was the first, or one of the major black labels, music catalogs that crossed over. The white population referred to the music as beach music. It was the music that they might not have heard in their school year, but when they went to the beach in the summers, this was the soul music that they heard. Absent that, there was not so much crossover to the musics, both white and black, here in Richmond and the Mid-Atlantic. Unlike places like New York or San Francisco, where there was a kind of a two-way crossing. Black people listened to the Beatles and some of the rock era music, and white people listened to Motown and some of the soul music, particularly Stax Volt. For me, I won't say it posed a problem, but it posed a problem because my own musical taste was much broader once I left Richmond. I had grown up on soul music, but I did get infused with some rock music while I was in New York and at Columbia, and then certainly by the time I went to San Francisco, the psychedelic rock music was a part of my palette. When I came back to New York, my transition went from New York to San Francisco and back to New York for a few years. When I got back, by the time I got back to New York, I had become an African jazz artist. Played with a man in San Francisco, Ndiko Aba, who was a Zulu from South Africa, taught me a lot about African music, also taught me this concept of music being more than just a pastime, more than just entertainment, but could be a force for a political force. It could be a force for social change. It could be a dynamic business or economic generator for the black community. I brought that philosophy back to New York and played with the avant-garde jazz scene, which in itself had several different nuances, one of which was an Afrocentric one. My group Juju was one of the Afrocentric groups of that movement. We played African drums under my wild screaming saxophone. We found some favor in New York with that community. So by the time let me just say, in passing, it's awfully difficult to make it as an artist in New York because there's so much music and so many musicians. Eventually, I moved back to Richmond with my band. And in 1974, I found a scene in Richmond that was post-civil rights in some ways, but not quite finished with civil rights in others. So I implanted, and this has become somewhat of my life's mission, going abroad in the broadest sense, someplace like San Francisco or to Africa, going abroad, learning some things, seeing some things, and then bringing back what I have seen to Richmond. I have been in Richmond. I'm a Richmonder. There are people who joke with me in France. When I go there, they say, all you talk about is Richmond this, Richmond that, Richmond. And I do. I'm sort of an ambassador about Richmond, but I'm also an ambassador to Richmond. And so when I was in New York, I had the opportunity to work with Ornette Coleman. He had a gallery in his home. He had the first floor was a major art gallery in the Soho district, and I did that same concept when I came back to Richmond. I had a roommate, Llewellyn Harrison. We had a house on Churchill right across from Chimborazo Park, and we opened what was going to be the first commercial black arts gallery in the state of Virginia. And that art gallery not only presented some major artists, beginning with Murray DePillis, who would become Dean of VCU School of the Arts. He was a Chicago-based Afrocentric painter. But we also included music. My group Juju lived in the house upstairs. We performed downstairs. We had a series of events called Sundays at Sunset. And it was through this gallery enterprise that we introduced some of this Afrocentric avant-garde jazz to the Richmond community. The community in the immediate neighborhood was very receptive. It was an open house, it was art, it was arty, and they supported us. But Richmond at large, either based on because of the lack of marketing, was not very receptive to this brand of art music. As a result, I started an organization called Branches of the Arts. And Branches of the Arts was dedicated to promoting black art, to say it simply. And one of the things that we did through that organization was to challenge the state of Virginia. I'm not telling this story chronologically, but this is important. We challenged the state of Virginia, which was giving grants through the Virginia Commission for the Arts to various arts organizations. And for years, most of the money went to the Richmond Symphony, the Virginia Museum, the Richmond Ballet, and organizations like that. Black organizations received little or none of that funding. We challenged the state to say that either black arts, neighborhood arts, should be incorporated, or a separate pool of money should be created. But we had an attorney, and we threatened to have an injunction to stop all funding for non-essential programs in Virginia until we got that settled. To make that story go faster, they agreed to create pools of money, or at least to incorporate what they would call neighborhood arts or community arts to get some funding. And Branches of the Arts we incorporated, and we got some grants, and we also tried to help others in the community organize and get grants. One of the organizations that we helped found was the Richmond Jazz Society. Richmond Jazz Society was founded 30 years ago now, right here in this house, in what was my dining room, is now my studio. I put an ad in the paper asking people who might have been interested in forming a jazz organization to come. And I knew several people, and we invited those 8 people. They became the founders of Richmond Jazz Society. There were other organizations: Soweto Stage Company, Larry Bland and the Volunteer Choir, Izibu Muntu African Dance Troupe, which later splintered off into a second one, Elegba Folklore Society. And so we helped found these groups, help put them on a stable footing. We would be their fiscal agent, and until they got organized themselves. So that's a very long story preamble to our involvement in the arts, or specifically in music in Richmond post civil rights era. But it's an important point. The Richmond Jazz Society was instrumental in fostering an audience for jazz here. Ezibu Muntu and later Elegba Folklore Society were instrumental in introducing African music, traditional African music and African principles to the community. Larry Bland and the Volunteer Choir was one of those groups that were basically a gospel group, but sort of crossed over into entertainment. I like to think that Larry Bland was one of the first, if not the first, to institute choreography into the black gospel choir movement, which allowed him to be commercially successful and book gigs outside of the church, even though the music was still rooted in the Baptist tradition. So those were things that happened post-civil rights. Those were examples of what could happen, bringing outside influences or the impact of what was going on in the rest of the world to a city, a town like Richmond. Let me say also that you asked about venues, and because I knew you were coming, I did make a list just off the top of my head, just in one sitting, of some of the venues here in Richmond. I'll start with in the 60s, in my high school time frame, the two bowling alleys, the two black bowling alleys became venues. One was called the North Bowl, which was on North Avenue, and the other was Cool Lane. And both of those started out as bowling alleys. They became centers of congregation of young people, and eventually they both became nightclubs. North Bowl became the Sahara nightclub. The Sahara nightclub on North Avenue booked local acts, but they also did the Motown Revue. Actual Motown stars came and played there as a part of what I guess we refer to the Chitlin Circuit. Cool Lane also became a nightclub. And they became a nightclub because of some physical things. They were large, they had parking lots, people came there for entertainment, and the only entertainment, if you didn't have live music, was jukeboxes. And eventually the live entertainment part of it became more lucrative than bowling.
So they were doing bowling and presenting acts at the...
Not simultaneously. There was some crossover time, but they literally changed the venue from bowling alleys to nightclubs.
Oh, okay.
They put floors over the bowling alleys. They were going to be bowling alleys no more. They became dance floors, put a stage in, and they were very viable, very happening places, both for teenagers and adults, different nights, different times. But they became the first nightclubs that I personally habited or performed in. There was another nightclub called Chez Indigo, and I think it was located on First Street between Broad and Marshall on the second floor. I went there maybe my senior year in high school. It was a jazz club, fairly well appointed, very dark, not at all a down, much more upscale kind of jazz club. Mostly habited by adults. I went there trying to be sophisticated. But I myself got my indoctrination to jazz music through my band instructors, but also through my father joining the Columbia Tape Club. And after he ordered the Johnny Mathis and the Andre Previns that he wanted, he let me order some albums, and I ordered some Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dave Brubeck. I'm not sure if it was much beyond the fact of me wanting to be sophisticated, or even the covers. I might have bought the albums because of the covers, but some of them were classic jazz albums. Take Five is probably either the first or second most sold album in jazz history. I think it's been surpassed by Miles Davis' Kinda Blue now. But that was my indoctrination in jazz during the civil rights part, because the civil rights movement came to Richmond in the 60s, probably 64, 65 was when the sit-ins happened in the Woolworth store on Broad Street. Virginia Union University students. I wanted to go participate. My parents thought I was too young. I was still in high school, and they probably didn't want the controversy that these young people were generating. But it was in that time that I was personally blossoming and exploring and looking to jazz music as a way to express, or at least to hear some of the expressions that were going on. Other venues during that time, there was a club called Ovutees. I'm not even sure how it was spelled, but I think it's Ovoutees. Ovutees was a private club on Broad Street at the corner of Broad and Fouché. It's directly on the north side of Broad, across from what's now Terrence. So it's a vacant building now. It's a small. They used to hire me. It was one of the few places that would hire my band, Juju. And in my early crossover to R&B, I played there. There were other very similar private clubs. The Devil's Club, which was called Die Two-Tone, Die something. So still in existence across from Consolidated Bank, First and Marshall, just up on Marshall Street, just up from First Street. The Devil's Club. It was a private club operating sometimes after hours, but bands played there. Another club was called the Railroad Club on Chamberlain. I never played at the Railroad Club, but it was a similar club. And then there was a club called 533, which was a private upscale black club that often had live music. Another club, the Military Retirees, was a private club, or still is a private club. It was the largest of those venues, and even in those early days, they hosted local bands, but also some touring Southern Soul type bands and blues groups would play at the Military Retirees. Now, soon after the Richmond Jazz Society was formed, they opened a club on Chamberlain called the Richmond Jazz Society Club. And it was in that same area as the Railroad Club, Chamberlain, not so far south of Overbrook. And this club had jazz music. It was one of the first jazz clubs since back in the day with Shea Indigo. And they had mostly local jazz acts. During that time, Branches of the Arts also opened a building. We had a building on Clay Street. I forget the exact address. It used to be, had at one time been a black business school. And in that building we had classrooms, we had galleries, and we had the main space became a performance space, and we would have jazz music and play there. After that, there was a string of clubs that I would say maybe the 80s and 90s. There was a club called the Third World. Third World was on Broad Street near Laurel. It eventually had several incarnations. It was the Third World, then it became The Pass, then it became Scoundrels, then it became Ellington's, and then the last, it was Ivory's. So it was a very important building simply because it had all these different incarnations, all of which were, the Third World was a black club. It was started by 4 black college students from Virginia State University. And it was a black venue. My group, Juju, played there on the first floor. It was a very vibrant scene because it was for and by younger people in their 20s. It went out of business. The club became The Pass. It was white ownership, catering to VCU students. Later it became Scoundrels, which was the same. It was white clientele, but more upscale. It had been renovated. Later, a man, Earl Wynn, opened Ellington's there. Now I should pause and say Earl Wynn, before Ellington's, had another club that was extremely important. It was called the Blues Alley. Now the Blues Alley is the name of a club, a renowned club in Washington, but this was the Blues Alley in Richmond. It was on the corner of 6th Street and Marshall. It was across from the Blues Armory building. So it was called the Blues Alley. Now part of that story is the folklore of that venue is that it was very important because it was close to City Hall. And it was very upscale. It was very well appointed, very nicely appointed. And it became a place, a watering hole, if you will, for the black political class and for the black academic class. It was upscale, had live music. It was smallish, but the food was great and the music was very good. I played there every Friday for some time. My band would play every Friday there. And it was a hot club. People would be lined up, and Henry Marsh and the black city council members would come to Ellington's to have unofficial meetings because the charter of the city, I didn't know this till later, but the charter of the city was if they met anywhere in City Hall, it would have to be declared a public meeting, and they would have to take notes, and it would be open to the public. So they would retire. They might be having a meeting, then say, "Oh, let's go up the street to the club, have a drink." It would be informal, and that's where they would make deals and determine what was happening. All to my band backing them up. So it was a very important club. Footnote to that club went out of business when the owner was arrested. And the lore of it was that the owner was set up to be arrested because of something called Project One was coming. And Project One was where they built the 6th Street Marketplace in conjunction with the Marriott Hotel, which would link the Richmond Coliseum. And his club sat right square in it, and he didn't want to sell. And it was holding up the whole project. So there was this folklore that basically the powers that be had him set up to be arrested so that they could get that space.
And what was the charge?
Facilitating of a cocaine sale, where I don't know if he ever touched the drug, but he set up a sale.
Yeah.
And so they got that club. And that leads into another venue, which became the 6th Street Marketplace. That area where his club sat became a Mulligan's, or anchoring kind of bar and restaurant space, multi-stories. His place had been just a one-story ex-storefront, but they built a 3-story thing and made it into what we would call the Crystal Palace. It was enclosed, and it remained a very important venue for music in town, because that was a central focus during that period of entertainment: the Coliseum, the Marriott, and this 6th Street Marketplace. And also, as an aside, outside that marketplace, in the space between that Crystal Palace and the Coliseum, they would also have live music outdoors. And perhaps the largest crowd I ever played before was listed as 30,000 people who came to that site to hear Ray Charles' band for free. So Ray Charles for free. It wasn't that Plunky was there. We just were the opening act, but we got the benefit of his 30,000 people. I mean, it was people amassed there, almost literally hanging off the walls. But that too talks about some of the Richmond activities during this period, the 70s, 80s, 90s, because one of the most important aspects that sort of ties all of this long diatribe together is that in order for black music particularly, but music and the arts to have the impact that it has had, it required a political set of activities, some politics. The city powers that be had to be open to music. There had to be a crossover effect. For Project One and 6th Street Marketplace to even be built, it required some cooperation between the black community and the white corporate community. There was an organization called the Federated Arts Council, which determined through a series of studies that it would be beneficial to the city if the black community and the white corporate community could combine on some projects. It was determined that one of the best ways for this to happen, for this bridging to happen, for the tail end of what we call the civil rights movement to take effect, because even after the civil rights movement, Richmond was completely segregated. One of the ways it was determined that the community could be brought together was through the arts. This had happened in a number of other cities, and so Richmond wasn't the first. Richmond benefited from some other studies that had gone on, and it was determined that we could do something similar here. And the Federated Arts Council was the organization tapped to make that happen. They had a strong board. They were one of these organizations. They were basically an arts council of the arts organizations in town, all white for the most part. They got grants to be like the administrators, the presenters, while the Richmond Ballet and the Richmond Symphony were specifically geared toward a specific genre of the arts. The Arts Council was the organization that sort of facilitated the administration and marketing for the arts. And so, I'm making this much longer than it has to be. The Federated Arts Council determined, because they had a strong board, and what happened politically was Richmond could not vote for a period of 7 years because there was an injunction that went all the way to the Supreme Court about gerrymandering. One of the ways that the black community had, in the voting possibilities for the black community had been suppressed, was by constantly adding or annexing properties from the counties, from Henrico and from Chesterfield. So every time it got to the point that the black population might be strong enough to vote themselves in, they would add a piece of these white surrounding counties. It took 7 years, but basically the Supreme Court outlawed that gerrymandering and annexation specifically to dilute vote would be unconstitutional. Once that passed, we finally got a black mayor and a black majority of city council. But this was not the end that it could have been, because the white community, either through fear or through prejudice or for not knowing how to chart a course in this new setup, were not supportive of the black majority on the city council or their agenda. So the Arts Council was the organization that said we could get past this impasse by using our I could use the word very 5 times, very powerful board of directors. They had the who's who of, at that time, Richmond had 5 to 8 of the Fortune 500 corporations. So I'm not just talking about local corporations. I'm talking about mega corporations who were based here. CSX, the train company, what would be Dominion Power, the James River Paper Corporation, which was maybe they did the boxing for Kellogg's cereal. They made corrugated boxes. They did newsprint. These were big corporations, and their CEOs, not lower people, their CEOs sat on the board of directors for the Arts Council. So when the Federated Arts Council said, we are going to work with the city of Richmond, this will give you guys an opportunity to reach out, be supportive, bring the community together. And so one of the ways that the Arts Council decided to do it, boy, this has been a long way to say, we created festivals. We created June Jubilee, which was the first Richmond Downtown Festival. What that did was, on the one hand, it allowed the arts organizations to present themselves. It allowed the city of Richmond to be a sponsor and to generate it as understand it as a tourism, as a way to bring not just people from far away, but people from the counties, those close-in counties, to come to downtown. You won't be killed because it's a black mayor. It's a place we can have a good time, and it worked. June Jubilee was a raging success. Over the course of the first weekend, it got 30 or 40,000 people to come downtown, have a good time, and do what? Enjoy the arts, but most importantly, enjoy music. Music was this wonderful thing that could bring people together. Music has always been that, music has been that since the 30s, a way for the white community to interact with the black community. Now in the South, they had times when venues had a rope down the middle and the black people would be on one side and white people on the other, but they were still enjoying the same music. And so if you ask me what's the most important thing that has happened in Richmond in music since the civil rights era, is that music has been a force to bring people together in the same venue, at the same festival, listen to the same notes, hear the same lyrics, and understand that people can be together and it's going to be all right. And so if you fast forward to this past weekend where we had the Richmond Folk Festival, which generated 200,000 people, I would dare say that wouldn't have been possible unless we had these smaller festivals to show that, yes, you can have a festival. It can be in an inner city. It can be in an inner city that's even run by black people. White people can come and not get mugged. Black people can come and not be arrested. We can actually have a good time in the same space. This even works in venues where we don't have the music at the same time. Let me explain. You could have a venue like the Mosque, which was called the Mosque, and then it became something else, and now it's called, I think it's called Altria. There is benefit from people being able to just use the same venue, even if it's not at the same time. And what I mean is, when somebody comes to the Mosque and sees the Richmond Symphony, they see that this is a venue that's upscale. It has Egyptian tiles. It has a wonderful ceiling. It has great acoustics. It has velvet seats, and we come and see the Richmond Symphony. if we also hear that James Brown or Marvin Gaye is going to be there, it has the impact of saying that music is valid too. They're going to be in that same venue. There's another benefit. When you come to the mosque to see the Richmond Symphony, there's going to be advertisement of the other things that's coming. And you might see that a comedian is coming. And you'll see that James Brown is coming. And again, you have this attitude, one, that, okay, they must be all right because they're coming into this upscale place. Also, it means these things are going to happen in a space that I'm already comfortable with. So I, as a patron of the Richmond Symphony, I can come here. I might not go see James Brown at the Coliseum, not the Coliseum, the big one, but there was a venue on 2nd Street called the Coliseum where I doubt white people would ever have come because it was in the ghetto, it was in a bad section of town. But you bring that same act to the mosque, and so now it's okay for me to see it. And so in that way, the arts and venues and the presenters, these are the people who are not the content generators, but the people who create a milieu where the arts can happen. They become important to the community because they bring people here, they bring people together, and I think the arts have demonstrated almost the unlimited capacity that we have as a human race if we can come together and get past our differences. There was another venue that's extremely important. This was a club called the New Horizon. The New Horizon was located at the corner of Harrison and Broad. If you know anything about our geography, you know that's VCU area now. But the New Horizon was the first club to present reggae on a consistent basis. It didn't do reggae exclusively, but a big part of its presentations were reggae. But it was a club that was important because it was one of the venues that was the first to have both rock music on some nights and black music on other nights. I think primarily because of its location. It was right in what would be the center of the VCU area. VCU has expanded. I think that building was torn down or became another building that VCU has just finally gotten control of. But it was always a black club there. And it was a crossover club. There was another club, an upscale club called Tony's. Tony's nightclub was on the same block that Channel 6 TV is now. Tony's was a classic nightclub. It had the look of a nightclub that you would see on TV, hardwood floors, kind of in the round or semicircular tiers. And Tony's was a club that had white acts, but also had black acts. And these black acts tended to be the nightclubby, I don't know how to describe it, but kind of middle of the road, Vegas, on a Vegas tight lounge acts. Lounge is the word. Lounge acts would play there, but some black, some white. I don't know Tony's last name. I think he was Italian by trade. He also ended up having a club. When Tony's closed, he had another club down in Shockoe Bottom called Scandals. And then the last place that I would mention is, I think it's called Emilio's at the corner of Meadow and Broad. And for years, they have had jazz jams, weekly jazz jams, and a kind of a eclectic presentation of music. But it's been important because that's a place where VCU and University of Richmond jazz students could come and jam and get their chops together. And that was headed by a name named Dr. Branch, who's not related to me, but we always say we are in any case. Another important venue is Dogwood Dell. Dogwood Dell is the city's outdoor amphitheater type venue. And it was important because Recreation and Parks sponsored music there for some number of years. The earliest, let me say, it was a white venue. It was totally a white venue. It only had white acts. And at a certain point, my group and Larry Blandon Volunteer Choir became the first black acts to perform there. The first years that we performed there, we were not allowed to perform in the bowl itself. We performed on the balcony of the Carillon. But that venue is important, and important to the black community because, again, this is in segregated Richmond, and I'm talking at least till 78, maybe all the way to 1982. That segregation lasted that long.
At that space.
At that space. And again, this is the city's. This is the
city
city owns it, and the city books it, and the city pays for it. So this is a city venue that's totally segregated, all white. But it became important because when Larry Bland and Volunteer Choir played there on one Sunday in the summer, and Plunky and Oneness of Juju played there on some night, some secular night, the place would be completely packed. We have gotten there on different nights 10,000 people to this place that's meant to hold 3,000.
Yeah.
Now, the reason was not simply because Plunky and Oneness of Juju was so great and that Larry Bland was so great. It was the only time the black community got to come there. So whereas you might have 30 other performances during the summer spread out among the bluegrass group or Richmond Symphony or this or that, when the black group came there, it was the only time. So if the black community was going to come, that was going to be the night that it came. Now, that helped burnish my marketability and my reputation because Plunky and Oneness, if you looked in the paper, I have reviews from 10,000 people came to see Plunky and Oneness. We must have been great. We must have been fabulous. So that was an important part of my own development and Richmond for me post civil rights. A couple of other things. I mentioned June Jubilee. There was another series called Fridays at Sunset. Fridays at Sunset happened on Kanawha Plaza, which is a small park not far from Browns Island. I want to say it was done in response to, but that might be giving too much credit, done in response to a series called Friday Cheers. Friday Cheers is a Friday afternoon, evening, after work experience coming out of that same tradition of Federated Arts Council, June Jubilee, downtown festivals, doing things to enliven downtown. All these festivals were not done just for integration. It had broader purposes as well. Tourism, keeping people in downtown. People would work in the financial district, 5 o'clock, zoom out. A way to keep people downtown, spend money, have beer. Again, to show people they can have fun, give a kind of metropolitan view of Richmond. So they had these series of things. And so, again, Friday Cheers becomes a part of post-civil rights Richmond, downtown festivals in general.
And when did that start? That's still going.
It still goes on. It still goes on. And I would think in the middle 80s to late 80s, this is coming out of the Arts Council, political history or administrative history. The Arts Council spun off an organization called June Jubilee Incorporated as a separate corporation. Remember, the Arts Council was an administrative marketing arm. June Jubilee, because it was a festival, and they spun that off and said you can fundraise yourself. As part of that same political timing, another set of organizations were generated. Really what happened was the idea that the Arts Council and their powerful board working with the city government worked so well. They said we could do something even bigger than just the arts. We formed an organization called Richmond Renaissance. Richmond Renaissance was that same board of directors, a new nonprofit, but we're going to do even bigger projects. It was through Richmond Renaissance that Project One and these development projects came about. And spun off from that was an organization called Downtown Presents, which was, this is all things that moved out from under the umbrella of the Federated Arts Council. June Jubilee was an organization set up just to do that one festival, June Jubilee. So they said, well, this is working so well, we're going to do Richmond Renaissance, get some of the most powerful whites and blacks in town, and we're going to envision things for the future of Richmond. That was their charter. One of the things they saw was an arts district. An arts district which now exists in the exact place that we did a $50,000 study to say where should an arts district be located. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it has come to fruition. So they had spun off an organization called the Richmond Arts District Foundation, which I was the executive director of, to create an arts district in downtown Richmond. It was stopped because of politics when another mayor came in and said, "We don't want to continue that program." Another organization that was spun off was called Downtown Presents. I'm so long-winded. Downtown Presents is the same organization, changed the name to Venture Richmond.
Okay.
And that was the festival producer wing.
And that's a folk festival,
Friday Cheers, Second Street Festival.
Right.
All those are downtown. Their job is to create festivals to bring people to downtown Richmond. That's the history of that. So, Second Street Festival is one of those festivals. Friday Cheers is an ongoing weekly festival during the summer. A black private citizen, Ken Johnson, created Fridays at Sunset, which was not a competing festival. It was one that happened to go on at the same time, just a couple of few blocks away. But it was basically a black music festival, and that was in some ways relieved Friday Cheers from having to have a set of programs that serve both. It worked really well because even though the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is not viable, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's viable. It's not viable if you don't have equal resources to work with. But sometimes people choose to have separate but equal things. And so Friday Cheers went on for mostly white progressive rock acts. And Fridays at Sunset did R&B and later smooth jazz. It lasted for some years. Fridays at Sunset became the Richmond Jazz Festival. That's that man who created. He stopped doing that. His thing grew and grew with smooth jazz on Fridays in downtown. Outgrew Kanawha Plaza and said, I can do the next level and do a major festival of jazz. Again, that's history and connections. And
the scene in Richmond is sometimes described to me as peculiar because of laws around ABC and alcohol.
That's true.
Or throughout Virginia. And that could cause really strange situations, say, up in the D.C. metro where people have for a long time just left Northern Virginia to go into the district to drink.
To party.
And to party. And that the businesses up there are just losing out. And that you've got to, even today, if you want to serve liquor, you've got to be selling entrees that get approved by the board. And therefore you're not running a bar. You have all the overhead of a restaurant.
Exactly.
And you're going to go in and out of business just like any other restaurant, and you probably have less left over for the musicians the way bars would in other parts of the country.
Yes.
Did that have different implications, or I'm wondering if there was a kind of differential there between the black music scene and the white music scene? Because sometimes I've noticed on these riders, on the ABC licenses that are posted, that you can't have certain kinds of music, and sometimes hip-hop is specifically listed there, and I think, well, how is that legal? But how did that happen in the first place?
I think, yes, I've had relations with the ABC board, and yes, it does impact the black community, and in some ways much differently than perhaps the white community. Some of the sociology of it, to say the obvious, it has long been the case that on average, white families have 10 times or more resources, economic holdings than black. Whites go out to restaurants that can have live entertainment more than blacks. Whites can afford to eat at those restaurants, full service entrees, whereas blacks would tend to want finger foods and maybe some drinks. So it does impact what we've been able to do. There have been ways around it. Remember in my earlier diatribe, I talked about how many private clubs,
which is not a thing that I've experienced.
That you don't need to.
Right.
But in the black community, the way around some of those ABC laws was that if you were a private facility, you could serve liquor only. And you couldn't serve liquor there's this peculiar set of things. The members can have their own liquor. You can have lockers. You can have liquor on premises. You can serve liquor to your guests. So when people would come to the Devil's Club or a private club like 533 or some of the other private clubs, the Railroad Club, they would come not as paid public patrons, they'd come as the guest of somebody at the private club. Sometimes that was merely a technicality. Sometimes you'd sign to come in that you're a guest of. Sometimes they would assign you as a guest just to be on the right side of the law. They operated at clubs for all intents and purposes, but they were private clubs, and so that let them out from under some of the restrictions of liquor by the drink, having to serve entrees and all that because it was a private club. In the black community, you had a lot of BYOB, bring your own bottle type venues. The military retirees still operates like that a lot. They're a private club, and they can have they can rent their facility out and get a banquet license that allows them to have liquor by the drink or bring your own bottle as they choose, and you pay a difference. These things don't usually go on in the white community, though an organization like the Virginia Country Club operates under that. They are a private club, and there are a number of white private clubs. They're just done primarily for social reasons, not necessity. But yes, hip hop music has suffered because of that. Reggae music less so, because reggae and hip hop now has crossed over. Hip hop now is 30% of the music business. It's now the pop music of the day. But back in the day when hip hop was getting its start in its heyday in the early 90s, it was very much underfunded because, quite frankly, alcohol sales have been a big part of the music in the black community since 1905 in New Orleans. I mean, it is said that jazz music started in the speakeasies, in the body houses, where you come and get in the nip joints where you come and get alcohol, and all the way up to upscale Cotton Club, Las Vegas lounge. You're basically funding entertainment through these other vices, if you will, drinking and gambling. And so without that level of support, the music suffers. So you're faced with a couple of things in Richmond. You leave and go to DC or closest places where you can be a part of a music scene that gets some funding through these traditional realms. Or you can become nonprofit and create organizations that can help you get around these restrictions. Organizations that create festivals, for example, where you do sell beer, and you know, it's not unusual, and it doesn't have to be alcoholic beverages. As a part of my job at the Arts Council, I was the program director at the Arts Council, and part of our research for doing these festivals, one of the first two festivals in the country happened a place in Pittsburgh. It was called the Three Rivers Arts Festival, and one down in Austin, Texas. Both those festivals, those earliest festivals, were funded by beverage sales, soft drink beverages. What they did was, they did this innovative thing. They said vendors could sell food, but we, the festival promoters, can sell sodas. And they would generate $50,000 on a weekend just from selling sodas and water. Well, back then they didn't sell water, but sodas. So you could buy a hot dog, but the hot dog vendor couldn't sell. The festival promoter would restrict the beverage sale. So even when it's not alcohol, beverages and gambling have been part of the financing for music in general. But yeah, black art has, in some ways, been restricted a little by that.
But is that part of, I mean, that might be part of what the festivals are responding to, that economic dimension that further segregates the music communities even more. And so you've got to have some sort of thing to interrupt that.
That might be and festivals have, again, not just in Richmond, but festivals in Richmond have been I often think of us as Richmond as a festival town. I mean, we probably have 30 or 40 festivals annually. Some small, some just neighborhood, all the way up to the International Folk Festival, which is the biggest about, But festivals are a big part of modern development, urbanism, not just in Richmond. I was a part of a group that helped formulate at the National Endowment for the Arts a program that was called InterArts. It was the one program at the National Endowment for the Arts that was not genre specific. All of the other programs, you had a program for dance, a program for music, a program for visual arts, a program for all these things. But we found what the thinkers found was that wasn't enough, because there had to be a mechanism to get the arts to the people. And so we created not just that. It was an interarts because it was interdisciplinary arts projects, things that combine dance and music. Where would you get funding for festivals? Well, in the old days of the National Endowment, if you had a festival that had music, dance, visual arts, you went to each of those 3 separate programs and asked for money to support the music, dance, and art. But oftentimes you were underfunded or not funded at all because the people who were the most established in those artistic disciplines would resist. You can't give a part of our money to these people who are doing a festival that has all this other stuff. You're taking money from ballet. Right. You're taking money from the symphony. So no, we don't have it. So we had to create a program that was kind of a catch-all program that would fund interdisciplinary arts projects and presenters, the people who actually got artists to audiences. They were defined as the people who combine audience, art, and venues together, and marketing. And so that allowed the National Endowment to give money to organizations like that. And festivals were a major part of that. Festivals is that place where we determine, that's how you cross-pollinate. That's how you get people who may think they only like ballet to understand some clog dancing, because you put it in a festival and they might come for one thing and be exposed to another. The folk festival is the greatest example of that at all. People will come because Mavis Staples there, and then they'll see Sona, the African group, or that they never expected, and get entranced. So festivals are that. Festivals help us all. Festivals are a major part of presentation worldwide now.
I was wondering about that connection within the black community, say, between the more Africanist angle that you were bringing with Juju and what is typically represented as black music in Richmond at the Folk Festival, which is the Ingramettes. And so to hear that there was a connection through Larry Bland is something that's brand new to me.
Yeah.
What was that relationship like? I mean,
well, let me make a very broad general statement. The name of my group is called Plunky and Oneness. The theory behind that term oneness is that all black music is related, particularly black music here in the United States, and particularly black music in a place like Richmond. And by that I mean the same musicians who taught in the public schools were the jazz musicians by night. And the same musicians who play at church on Sunday are the same musicians who played at the club Saturday night. So the connection is already there. The connection is there across musical genres within the black community. I think, I'm not an expert on the white community, I think that it's possible, if not probable, that there are classical white musicians that don't play R&B or don't even play church music. Some classical music is church related, but in the black community, those musicians are the same musicians. They're the exact same people, same bodies. So there's a connection. What I have done personally, I'm not claiming any credit, but one of the things that I tried to bring to this community is to show the relationship of traditional African music and how it relates historically to what was blues music and R&B music and jazz music and later soul music and funk music, to show that those theories, that theoretical African music is the basis for that. My groups were called Juju, then Oneness of Juju. What that was saying was this concept of Africanness, this African theory, or musicology, the African musicology, is a through line. The slaves that were brought here, the people who were brought here and enslaved, brought with them a part of culture. Their culture was, nothing was done in Africa that wasn't done with music. Farming, battle, weaving, teaching the children, worship, learning, history, recording history, all to music. So you brought a people here for whom music was a central part of their culture, and planted them here and say, you can't speak your native language and you can't play the drum. Some other places in this hemisphere you can play the drum, but not here, not with the British. British say you can't play the drum makes you wild and uncontrollable. You can communicate with the drum. We know y'all can talk to these drums. The black people would say, the drums aren't making us wild and uncontrollable. The drums are connecting us to our power, to our spirituality, to our history. But the black people, and I'm in my regular lecture, but the black people found ways to keep that musical heritage alive. They sang while they worked in the fields. This was condoned for two reasons. One, if you could hear the slaves over in the North 40 singing, we knew where they were. And number two, it's documented. They pick more cotton when you let them sing in rhythm than if you keep them silent. So as a efficiency program and as a locational program, it's okay if you do this music. And the music that these black people sang in this strange land was African. Even when they couldn't sing their language, if they say, you can't say kumbaya, you can say come by here. So that, and there's a through line. I mean, there's a traceable through line of this music and how it developed. And so long-winded answer again. So for Plunky to show Larry Bland that African connection, it's an aha moment, not a moment that would be resisted. So Ezigbo Muntu and Elegba Folklore Society had a direct relationship to the rhythms that Larry Bland and gospel choirs are clapping and singing. Because it's basically African music. It's basically Bible stories put to the blues. Not the blues really, it's the pentatonic scale that's played on African balafons and thumb pianos. It's the same tonality. And black people just created a way to be Africans here. So for me, the concept of oneness is that all of that music is one. It all has a through line, the same kind of spirituality, the same kind of usefulness, the same kind of utilitarian valuation system. It's not based on beauty of did these notes sound good? No, it's did it get us off? Did it motivate us did it move us? Even if it was an ugly guttural sound, did it move us? Did it serve the purpose? So that's a different aesthetic, and that's the aesthetic of black music and black art in general, even with some exceptions. So it didn't meet any resistance. It was more enlightening people to say, oh, what you think of is gospel music, or you think what I'm doing is so wild and different. It's really from the same root.